All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Maya, and I'm so excited to present our next speaker, Dr. Matthias Mehl. Dr. Mehl is a professor of psychology at the University of Arizona and is here today to speak about his research and how the parts of our daily lives that we may consider trivial can actually impact our health and well-being in profound ways. Please welcome Dr. Mehl.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me. It's such a great pleasure. I wish I could be out there in the beautiful Bay Area and the beautiful campus you have, but I really enjoy also connecting with you here. So the talk I want to give is on kind of it's not really a new way, for sure not. And as you will see, actually, a former faculty at UC Berkeley really, to me, was instrumental in shaping this thinking. But a way to slightly reframe our thinking around how we think about coping, and I know this conference is about resilience, about how we deal with the things that we deal with in psychology. And of course, we did not try the forward button. Let's see, why does this not work? Okay, good. So what is psychology? And obviously, we don't need to deal with this much here, but psychology is study of the mind and behavior to understand and enhance behavior in various settings of human activity. The big question to me is, what kind of behavior are we talking about? And what kind of settings are we talking about? Are we talking about the big behaviors and the big settings of life, the big stages of life? Or are we talking about the little behaviors and the little settings of life? And in general, I think it's fair to say that our general paradigm in psychology, the way psychologists have approached studying things, is from this critical life event perspective, I would say. So we can call what we currently have a critical life event psychology. So from a critical life event perspective, life unfolds, and what happens is that there's this flow of life, and it's accentuated at times by critical life events. Those could be positive life events, those could be negative life events. It's important to say that none of these life events really are normative. Many people experience them, many experience don't them. There is a first love, a first job, there's marriage, there's parenthood, divorce, an accident, unemployment, and so on, chronic illness, retirement. Again, I think it's very important. This is not a normative trajectory, but these are the events that psychological scientists have studied when they study coping and by extension also resilience. So more for the negative, which are listed below, than for the positive. Actually, there's positive, negatives up there as well. But how do people adjust to a first job? How do people adjust to parenthood, to unemployment? And this is it's a really important line of research, and I'm a big fan of it. Here's, for example, some research that I'm very fond of, that I really like. So these are some studies just pulled as prototypical studies, how people adjust to life events such as marriage, widowhood, divorce, unemployment, disability, and severe disability. And you see, with a critical event being in the middle, that there is often a decrease in life event, for example, widowhood. And you see that actually it's interesting that even for widowhood, about a couple of years before, the life satisfaction drops already. And then, of course, it takes several years to go back up. And as you see, it doesn't make it fully back up. There's a bit of a gap that remains. In marriage, the same thing. You have an increase, kind of an anticipated increase in life satisfaction already. And then after, like year by year, you have a little decrement as you adjust kind of to the realities of life, and this is really interesting. You can see, do people fully accommodate after critical life event? Do we go back up to the baseline? Is there a gap in the end? That was long a debate in the field. A very interesting and very important research focused on exactly those discrete life events. Another example is another field of mine that is really very exciting, or a field that I find very exciting, and there's research, a lot of research going on at UC Davis and also at UC Berkeley on life event and personality trait change. So theory and research have emphasized the impact of life events on personality trait change. So what we see here is, for example, this is from an article that was published a few years ago that tries to summarize personality trait change measured by the Big Five and how it relates to different life event categories. And on the left side in blue, you kind of see more the agentic domain. On the right side, more the relationship domain. And you see, you don't pay too much attention on the exact findings, but you see that different life events are reliably related to certain patterns of personality trait change. So, for example, starting college usually leads to an increase in openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, decrease in neuroticism. We call that socialization. Or social maturity. Taking on a new job usually leads to an increase in conscientiousness. Unemployment, maybe not too surprisingly, leads to a decrease in conscientiousness and increase in neuroticism. But the findings are actually not that clear. But it's not really what's critical here. Is not the specific patterns, and you see it over there as well. As people start a romantic relationship, usually neuroticism drops and extroversion increases. On the other hand, for marriage, then you have a pattern where the extroversion goes back and kind of focus on kind of the dyad, and openness also decreases a little bit. So the main point is that we can organize psychology and psychological changes around these critical life events. On the other hand, what a critical life event approach blurs is that from a measurement perspective, life events are really relatively bad proxies of what is really happening. And let me elaborate on that. So number one, life events impact different people differently. There's huge variability around the average trajectories. There's also different type of trajectories. So when you take divorce, for example, some people experience a delight, an increase in life satisfaction right after that because they've managed to they made the decision, they've managed to come out of a non-functioning relationship. Some people never recover from a divorce that they did not want to. Same thing around widowhood. Some people never really catch up to where they were before, and they have this what's called prolonged grief. Some other people have a year of going through it, maybe two, and in the end, they find a new life and they move on. And you can go through this. So different people really have different trajectories, and different people also react differently to events. And the question is why? And life events, beyond that, life events impact different people on different time scales. So some people have an immediate response to a critical life event. Some people have a delayed response. There's even anticipated responses. So often, for example, as I had hinted at, when you study divorce, that you see things changing actually before. Well, technically, I think the separation is before, but sometimes even before the separation, more like aligning with when the decision to separate is made, that people change. So very different kinds of responses and patterns, very different kinds of scales. And from a process perspective, it also matters that life events do not only exert a macro impact. In fact, I think in many cases, the macro impact, it's really a summary label, like divorce changed life like this. It wasn't really the divorce that changed that. It wasn't really the widowhood. It was all the little things that you subsume under the label divorce and widowhood that changed. The active ingredient in this life event impact is at the micro level. So the changes in people's daily thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So when you take bereavement, for example, the death of a loved one is not, the macro level impact, there can be macro level impact. You can have, for example, the financial situation can change in a way suddenly and drastically that puts it different. But a lot of times the impact comes from the grieving, which is that you do the things that you normally do with your partner that has passed away. And so every day you encounter a myriad of situations and thoughts and behaviors that feel different, and that's what causes the pain, and that's what causes the adjustment. And finally, life events do also not hit people at time zero. They impact people in the midst of the flow of their normal daily life. So we saw in the graph, it's like all centered around time zero. This is not really this is how scientists can organize it after the fact. But you get caught in the middle of the act. You're like in the middle of a good day, and suddenly you get the phone call that somebody passed away. So much of it really happens from this very momentary perspective, from this experiential perspective that people experience in their daily lives. So here's a quote that really resonated with me, and it's by the late Kenneth Craik, who was a famous ecological psychologist and who was a faculty at UC Berkeley. I've unfortunately never managed to meet him in person. I feel fortunate, and I keep a dear record of when I exchanged communications with him, and even though we were perfectly in the time of email, he preferred letter communication. So I wrote him a letter about a paper that I published that I wanted to share with him, and he wrote an incredibly thoughtful answer back weeks later in a typed letter. So I have very dear memories about that. So Kenneth Craik said, "Perhaps our scientific tendency to neglect the ordinary humdrum aspects of daily life reflects some limitations in the conceptual systems we have formulated." So the ability to neglect the ordinary humdrum, it is very functional. When you think of your day at the end of the day and say, what did you do today? What stands out is the salient aspects of your day, right? I went to meet this friend, I did the grocery, I went to work, not all the little things in life. On the other hand, lives are lived day by day, one day at a time, from day to day, day after day, day in, day out. Lives as we experience and observe them are inherently quotidian. To me, this is really the essence of it. What I think I want to argue in this talk is not that we need to do anything profoundly different, but that it will be helpful to complement our perspective on studying people around those major salient big things, the big psychology, and to complement that with the little psychology and why this is important. So what I want to propose is kind of an alternative, complementary paradigm. Sounds too big, just an alternative way of thinking that in the spirit of Kenneth Craik, we could call quotidian psychology. And quotidian psychology, it probably started way before that, but one of the first big examples is the work by Barker and Wright, a team of two of the big founding ecological psychologists, where what they did was they put together a team of observers and followed the 7-year-old Raymond Birch for an entire day through his day, and it was April 22nd, 1949, in Kansas. Why did they do so? They took a team of 7 observers, and they had notebooks, and all they did was write down everything, every little thing that Raymond did from the moment he got up to the moment he left. It was such a paradigm shift, such a profoundly different way of thinking about psychology. I mean, this was still in the time of late behaviorism, and so you see, I mean, Barker and Wright were fed up with the constraints, the confines of the psychological laboratory. They had it very clear that what we need to do is not bring participants into the laboratory and expose them to a very narrow and rigid standardized set of circumstances, but rather bring our laboratories to the participants and observe them in what they're naturally doing in the ordinary contexts of their everyday lives. And the result of this groundbreaking work was a comprehensive written record of all of the behavior. It was a 400-page book of what Raymond did from 7 a.m. in the morning to 8:32 at night. I have the book. I cannot say that it's the most exciting book that you could possibly read. Here, for example, it's an excerpt. And this is how it goes over all the 400 pages. 7:02, his mother asked, "Do you want to put this undershirt on, or do you want to wear the one you have on? Raymond sleepily muttered something in reply. His mother left the room and went into the kitchen. 7:03, he pulled his right sock on. He picked up his left tennis shoe and put it on. Well, hopefully he already had the left sock on. He laced his left shoe with slow deliberation, looking intently at the shoe as he worked steadily until he had it all laced. He put his 7:04, he put his right shoe on. So as you can imagine, I mean, this book, it's a piece of history, and it's really impressive. It's incredibly boring in the detailed description of all the day, but it's a profound change from how scientists have worked. And in that, it has very big historical significance. In its focusing on the everyday things that humans really do instead of what scientists make them do in the laboratory. Of course, this was not feasible. Of course, you couldn't do this. I mean, so we needed to scale it up. And to scale it up meant, in this case for Kenneth Craik, that he wanted to make use of the now in the late 90s and in the 90s, early 90s actually, make use of what at that time you called portable miniature video cameras. So Kenneth Craik built on Barker and Wright and with what he called the live day analysis. And he took these miniature portable video cameras, which at that time were these cameras that you had to still carry on your shoulder, and had these tapes, VHS tapes and everything in there. And he did follow the same idea. He audio and video recorded a day of Lorna Dodge in Berkeley on December 4th, 1990. And of course that makes it, I mean, it's a significant advance because you now have the full audio and video record. So it's not restricted to what the observers were able to write down. You can also go back to it. And it was really fascinating. One thing that stuck with me when I read this, Kenneth Craik coined the term, the fast forward effect, that when his RAs then watched the videotape of these recordings, that there was such a strong temptation for the RAs to fast forward to the next salient episode. And it was very difficult to just go with the passing of time and the passing of the day. But much of our day is ordinary humdrum. And therefore, psychologically, much of what influences us is ordinary humdrum, not necessarily the things that we attend to, that stick in our mind, that we memorize. So what I've been doing, or trying to do in my research, is to scale up. I see my research very much in the tradition of these two approaches, and trying to scale up. I'm shying away from really scaling up because I think the really scaling up happens now with mobile sensing research. But to scale up from an N of 1 to an N of, I don't know, maybe 100 or 200, where we can really follow people in their lives. So what we've developed in my lab, the electronically activated recorder, the ear method, and you see on the slide kind of how things have changed over time. Originally, the ear was an analog tape recorder that had a chip attached to it and a battery pack, and it had a microcassette, a 45-minute microcassette that you had to flip after one day. So it was really just really difficult. Then in the second generation, we had a Sony voice recorder with the precursors to the SD cards, these Sony memory sticks of 8 megabyte, I think 248 megabyte of recording capacity. But we were delighted because now we had actually timestamps with the audio recordings. And what the ear does, and what the ear did from the very beginning, and what the ear still does right now, is that we record very short sound bites. So usually 30-second sound bites repeatedly, intermittently, several times per hour. Historically, we've settled on the pattern of 30 seconds, 5 times per hour. Ironically, this is really a historical artifact of that way you fit one full day of sampling on a 45-minute microcassette. But it has actually proven quite useful also in terms of how much data we can handle in terms of codings. But what's important is, so we really get this these sound bites after sound bites from people's lives as their day unfolds. So we hand out the participant the ear device, and again, initially it was this micro cassette recorder, then it was the Sony recorder, then it became later an app. So first an iPhone app, now it's an Android app. We actually still do give people an extra device instead of their own phones, because just that way we can ensure that the audio is decent. And people bring it back to us and hand it back, and that way we get an acoustic day of a person's life as it naturally unfolds. So you hear in the morning the crunching of the cereal, you hear later the driving to work, you hear a few interactions, you hear typing of the keyboard, you hear all these little sounds. Obviously, there's lots of things you don't get, it's all the video part or the seeing, but there's a lot of information that's acoustically encoded. And of course, with that come important considerations. So this research usually invokes a lot of privacy questions. And it's important that in this kind of research, you really need to get the participant on board. The participant needs to know. I mean, same thing with Barker and Wright's research and with Craik's research. Participants need to know, why are you doing this? Why are you slapping audio recorders on me? And why are you eavesdropping on my life? If there's any sense of concern or paranoia, the participants are just not going to wear the recorder. For us, we make it very clear that we're not interested in anything that is private, in anything that's embarrassing. Particularly, we're not interested at all in getting anything that participants don't feel comfortable sharing with us. That's why we provide them with an opportunity. So first of all, when they don't feel comfortable, they should just put the device away, and that's perfectly okay. It's important that they then tell us that they were not wearing the device so that we don't get confused about what was going on, but we really want them to just only wear it when they feel comfortable. And even with that afterwards, they have a chance to listen to their recordings, to go over the recordings and check them. And if they see that, for example, oh man, Friday afternoon, 4 o'clock, oh, that was something I'd rather have deleted. No questions asked, we delete that. We just document how many sound files get deleted, but not what we, and this is prior to us ever having access to the sound files. So when the participant turns over the sound files to us, it is with the consent that participant says, I am ready to share these data. With this methodology, over the last, by now even more than 20 years, we've done a series of studies, starting mostly with regular social behavior, how it relates to personality, how it relates to stress, how it relates to coping. Then we've moved to studying clinical samples, patients with arthritis, cancer patients. We've studied individuals after divorce. And we're now just wrapping up a project in collaboration with Brown, where we study adolescents who come home after return back home to their families after psychiatric hospitalization for a suicide attempt. That's, of course, a really sensitive context, and we're very cognizant of the fact and have extra safety measures implemented in that. But there as well, we find actually quite good compliance. And again, the reason I think we do that is because we convey to the participants why this matters, because there's no way that when we ask, for example, how much time have you spent interacting today? How often have you laughed? I could not tell you. How many positive and negative emotion words have you used? How many first person, second person pronouns? There's no way that people can cognitively represent that. So when you develop a new method, of course, you need to answer the question, why do you need that? Why does the field need that? So for a while, we went through a series of studies that aimed at showing the added value of this kind of naturalistic observation approach. And I just want to highlight one here that I think makes this point most directly. And that's a study that was inspired by a book that's by now, of course, already quite old. This was in 2006, I think, by Luann Brizendine, The Female Brain, Luann Brizendine, who is at UC San Francisco, so on the other side of the bay, and where she wrote, a woman uses about 20,000 words per day, while a man uses about 7,000. I should say that in the consecutive editions, she did take out the numbers. She didn't really change the basic idea of the difference that suggests these talkativeness differences, but the numbers were taken out. And importantly, all of this is hardwired into the brains of women. These are talents women are born with that many men, frankly, are not. I don't want to get too much into this, but I think it's fair to say that the chatty Cathy stereotype that's kind of usually framed this way of women talking a lot, that talents is a slightly positive spin, I think, on that. But we saw this and we're like, wow, this is really interesting. And also Mark Lieberman, a linguist, saw this and he wrote about this on his blog, Language Log. He said, well, where do these numbers come from? Do we know how many words people speak in a day? And he traced it back to the research, and he couldn't find any empirical investigation where somebody estimate how many words man and woman use in a day. And so this is when we realized, well, at that time we had about 3 or 4 studies, I think, and we knew we sampled 30 seconds every 12 minutes. So that's about 5% of the day. And so we can count the words that we sample in these 5%, and then we can extrapolate from there to 100%. So we're like, well, this is interesting. We can estimate that. For my part, I do want to say that I probably also expected that there would be a slight advantage. The numbers would be slightly higher for women than for men. I did have serious doubts that this would be an effect size where the genders are about. I think that would be about a D of 2.0 apart. You hardly find any behaviors, any effect sizes of that magnitude. So it was clear that people used the gender magnifying glass and making behavioral differences bigger than they are. But I mean, I grew up in this society. I'm part of it, so I'm exposed to the stereotypes. So I wouldn't have been surprised if we had found that women talk slightly more. So we looked at this and simply estimated the daily word use from the sampling we had. And what you see here is on the right side are the male participants, on the left side the female participants. And the first thing you see is that the distributions are really quite similar. The second thing you see is that, intriguingly, the 3 most talkative participants were actually men. In terms of the means, there wasn't really much difference. For men, we estimate 15,669 words. For women, we estimate 16,215 words. And then some people indeed wrote a commentary to this that was never published and said, well, but this is obviously SUC. This is confirming the hypothesis that women do talk more. I mean, there's 500 words more, right? So this is where you have statistics for. So the effect size of this is D of 0.07, which is trivial. And what I like about the study is that it doesn't even need p-values. You see that 500 words is really trivial, but of course it wasn't significant at that sample size. To me, what I find fascinating is the huge variability between people. We had one participant that over the course, a male participant, over the course of a day, spoke approximately 800 words. That's an abstract in the morning, an abstract at lunchtime, and an abstract at dinner. Nothing in between. And we had one person that in the same time, also a male, managed to speak 47,000 words. And let me see whether this works here right now, but this is an example of a soundbite of that person.
They did it to make her mad, I think. Anyways. But that's just the kind of stuff that they do. I mean, her mom, it's like they're really nice. Like, some days they're, like, super nice and all loving and stuff, and then other days it's like, don't even go in that house. But anyways, so she didn't get to go, and she was really upset because she'd always wanted to go there, so I had planning on surprising her, and I made up a lie saying we were going somewhere else. And I was going to take her there, and then we got back.
So what's fascinating is you hear the person talking and talking and talking, and this is where I should do a big shout out to our RAs who transcribed this person, because this is how it goes, sound file after sound file after sound file. And interestingly, also, if I asked you what did the person talk about, you don't really, it's hard to actually pin down a theme, right? But very interesting. So this is 47,000 words a day. I should say that inspired by the fact that those numbers continue to be used, and that the stereotype of the talkative woman continues to be present, and it recently came up also in the context of the Olympics in Japan, as some of you may have heard. So we're now going back and trying to redo the analysis in a replication study. We don't know when this will come out. We're just gathering the data of many investigators, maybe with a sample size of about 2,000, and re-estimate that. But what's important from the methodological perspective is, so for the purpose of showing what this observation method can do that other methods can't do, we can have our ears, so to say, on the ground, and we can measure all the little words in life that people say. And when you ask participants how talkative they see themselves, and this is where I want to make a shout out to Oliver John, who's also at UC Berkeley, because his Big Five inventory contains the first item, I think in the BFI2, it's not the first item anymore. I consider myself to be a talkative person. And this is beautiful for us because we now can juxtapose self-perceived talkativeness against actual talkativeness. And what we find is that there is a reliable, not a huge, a reliable gender difference in perceived talkativeness. Women perceive themselves as more talkative in the absence of actually talking more in daily life. And that's fascinating because that way, for the first time, we can study how people construe themselves from the inside out, and how people behave kind of from the outside in. And we can see convergence and discrepancy. So we can do things that otherwise we could not do if we didn't have this kind of observational method, not naturalistic observation method. So having established that this method has empirical use and can provide information that is beyond what other methods can do at times, I want to now give 3 examples of where we have adopted this quotidian perspective in daily life. The first one is how well-being relates to daily conversations. And there you can really have 2 different perspectives in terms of how happiness relates to a social life. You can have the perspective that really, if you enter into the deep existential depths of life, you're bound to end up being depressed. So try to stay away from it. Try to enjoy life. Try to be happy. Take it easy. And so if that's the case, then we should find that the more people have deep conversations, the more they end up being depressed and experience negative affect because it kind of pulls them down. Or vice versa, you could say, well, human beings are we're a symbolic species. We require meaning in our life, and absent that meaning, we cannot really be happy. So it is that satisfaction with life and meaning is established in these conversations that are particularly meaningful. And so we did this in a first study with about 100 students, where we coded these sound files for, first of all, whether the person was alone in a sound file or talking with somebody else, or in a conversation. And then if the person was in a conversation, whether the conversation was small talk, so a trivial conversation where no real information was exchanged, or substantive. It's kind of an odd label, and I acknowledge that we wanted to call it deep conversation, but then not too many conversations really qualify as deep. We also thought about calling it meaningful conversations, but that seemed like a transgression because we don't know from the sounds whether this was meaningful for the participants. But what we can say is that there was real information exchange, there was real substance exchange, so we call it substantive conversations. And what we found was that, first of all, so on the x-axis you see well-being, from low well-being to high well-being. On the y-axis you see the percentage of time the ear caught the person alone versus talking with others. We see a very nice effect that the more time people spend alone, the less happy they are. The more time they spend with others, the happier they are. And in this study, we had self-reports of happiness, we had informant reports of happiness, we had satisfaction with life. So it's across a robust index of well-being. So the more time people spent in conversations, irrespective of what kind of conversation it is, the happier they were. The correlation is around 0.30, and we can talk about that. Is that a big conversation? Is that a small conversation? I think this is where, again, it comes in to have this kind of natural metric, because we see here the unhappiest person down there in the blue line crossing the Y bar had an estimated 20-something% of conversation, and the happiest person on the other end had almost twice as many conversations. So the difference between the unhappiest person and the happiest person is a doubling in conversations. In addition to that, we found in this study that the more participants engaged in small talk, the unhappier they reported being, and the more participants report having substantive conversations. Sorry, the more the ear caught them in substantive conversations, and the more the ear caught them in small talk. So this is ear caught, not reported. So the ear caught substantive conversations correlate positively with well-being small talk negatively. And again, here, for example, the effect size, this is the substantive conversation. The unhappiest person had about 20%. Every fifth conversation was substantive, and the happiest had almost 50%. So almost every other conversation was substantive. The unhappiest person had more small talk than substantive conversations. So this was an interesting study, but this is really happiness in 96 US college students. And since this study, also the whole replication crisis went down on our field, and it made us think as well. So we went back and tried to replicate this in a much larger sample of now almost 500 people. And we did confirm very nicely the effect for the quantity of people's daily social interactions. So we found that the less people spend time alone, the happier they are, and the more they talk with others, the happier they are. The correlation is just like you would expect, just like the replication crisis found, that you get a certain attenuation of the effect size, because most likely small sample sizes leads to an accentuation of effect sizes. But beyond that, nothing has changed really here. And the difference between the happiest and the unhappiest participant is about 4 hours of conversations. So it's really quite a graspable effect, and something that you should almost see with a mere eye, even though the correlation is only 0.20, right? Only, quote unquote. We then also wanted to replicate the effects of well-being and the quality of daily interactions. And these are our samples here. And overall, what you see is that we do replicate that substantive conversations correlate positively with well-being, but we did not replicate that small talk is negatively related to well-being. That is important, because when you look at how the media covered the first article, the vast majority of media coverage went to that small talk is bad for you. And at that time, that seemed like the complementary finding to meaningful conversations is good for you. On the other hand, on some level, it also makes sense, because, and back then already, I had conversations with some small talk researchers that called me and said, well, but small talks are necessary. You can't skip that critical part. I mean, it's the lubricant of our social lives. We need it. If you get rid of it, things start squeaking. And I think this is how I see this finding right now, that small talk really is kind of the inactive ingredient in a pill. So you can't, if you want to take a medicine, it needs to be wrapped in a pill, and the pill needs to have an inactive ingredient, and you need the medicine in there, and you need the inactive ingredient. What works is obviously the medicine, but you need the inactive ingredient as well. So what we can say from that is that the happy daily life is social rather than solitary, and conversationally deep rather than superficial. And in the replication, we realized that we need to scratch that. So we say it's conversationally deep. And I think from the perspective of this quotidian psychology, what I think is really important when you take these data seriously, what it shows is that every minute counts. So take our example of the amount of time spent talking relating to well-being. This was a linear effect, and there wasn't a leveling off or anything. So this suggests that every minute of interactions has kind of an incremental dose. And this is even the case averaging across all types of interactions. So let this be the conversation with a cashier at whatever grocery store. Let this be the barista at Starbucks or any other coffee shop. Let this be the neighbor or somebody, a stranger in the street. And Gillian Sandstrom is doing wonderful research on that. Or let it be friends or partners in our life. So really, I think to me, this is a good example of the quotidian perspective because it focuses on the every interaction, not just those accentuated interactions. Getting closer to your theme of resilience, we conducted a research on couples coping with cancer because we wanted to know how cancer changes people's daily lives. And this was an investigation. It was actually my first grant as an assistant professor, and it was inspired by this quote. One fundamental key question that emerges is just how much cancer intrudes upon and organizes the lives of couples confronted with a disease. Direct sampling of their interactions and daily experiences could prove illuminating in this regard. So what we did is we recruited 52 couples where one person was coping with breast cancer. So we had 52 breast cancer patients, stage 1 to 3, stage 4, and they were all in adjuvant treatments who received chemotherapy or radiation, and we recruited also their cohabitating partners. Both the patient and the partner were there for 1 weekend, and we just wanted to hear their interactions. And then we invited them back 2 months later and measured their adjustment, their well-being, anxiety, and depression, and so on. And I remember it very well. It was really my first study as a professor at the University of Arizona, and I recruited my research team, and I was very concerned. I had the RAs listen to the daily life of cancer patients, so I was really thinking through what should we do, how should we handle the debriefing, what should we do if this is just too distressing for the participants? Do I need to provide them with the possibility to some of supervision or reach out to a counselor? And what was really interesting is that the first RA came back after listening to the first participants and told me, Dr. Mehl, had you not told me that this couple is dealing with cancer, I wouldn't have known. Their life seems so surprisingly normal. And so this was a couple that I remember was organizing a party for that weekend and having friends over. And it's very important, I think, in this to keep in mind, this is in no way saying that cancer is indistinguishable in daily life from not cancer. That's not by far not what I want to say here. But it was really the degree of normalcy that this couple and as we will see, the other couples experienced really surprised the participant, and it also surprised me. So I came from a tradition where I was trained in disclosure research. My mentor was Pennebaker, so the expressive writing paradigm, people writing about trauma. So I expected this to be full of very serious conversations and reflecting and coping conversations. And why wouldn't, or how wouldn't I, right? I mean, all the research that or most of the research we see asks around, gives people cancer coping questions. When thoughts come to your mind, how do you deal with these thoughts? How are you dealing with the cancer experience right now? Are you reframing some of this? Are you distracting yourself from the stress that emerges from the cancer? But everything is around the stress that emerges from the cancer. At the same time, from the experience of these cancer patients, the daily life goes on. Yes, now with the cancer diagnosis and with the added stress of the cancer experience. But nevertheless, they had to get up in the morning. The dogs needed to be taken for a walk. The kids needed to get out to school. There needed to be food on the table. Who does the grocery? Who carries out the trash? What are we going to cook for dinner? What are we going to do this weekend? There's so many of the micro decisions in life, the little things in life that continue to be there. And what dawned on me when we did the study is that by force of this methodology, completely unforeseen, it focused us on these little things in life. So this is a random half hour in the life of one of these couples. So here you see, this is at 1:30 in the afternoon. Here you see what we coded, whether the person is talking with other people, whether the conversation is cancer related, who the conversation partner is, and whether the TV was on. So you look like you're deep in thought. Person is talking with a significant other, and the TV is on. 9 minutes later, because it was 9 minutes sampling, nothing, and then after, no conversation, still watching TV. So I bet like you're looking forward to having the last treatment on Tuesday, huh? It gets to be a hassle going down there every day and staying there. This is clearly a cancer-related conversation. This is the partner talking, and we would code this as emotional support. But then just about 9 minutes later from this deep, emotionally supportive conversation, its life switches in a beautiful way to something quite different. So I've never seen such a stupid commercial. Well, it's got a coating on the outside, and you taste that first, and then until that flavor is dissipated, then you get into the other. So really kind of the very trivial aspects of life. And what I love about this method is how you can both put them together. And life doesn't care that they don't go to, that we think they don't go together. They go together 9 minutes apart. The very deep emotional support conversation and the very mundane, ordinary, trivial conversation about a candy. So what to me really was interesting and what stood out, on average in this study, 93% of the conversations were not about cancer. Had you asked me before, I would have guessed that probably around 20-30% of the conversations revolve around cancer. Only 7% were cancer conversations. Of the cancer conversations, so of these 7%, only about every fifth one was about emotional disclosure. And here I have one.
Get it cleaned up. Because I'm going to get well one of these days real soon, and I'm going to drive my car again. Go back to work.
So you see, we do find these conversations that she says, expresses optimism that she's going to get well again. She's going to drive her car again and go back to work. On the other hand, of those 7%, more than half of them were very pragmatic and informational in nature. So don't forget, on the 4th, I have a CT scan at 3 o'clock. Yes, she said you did need blood work on Monday. Okay. So not the kind of conversations that psychologists typically picture when they say these are cancer conversations, right? Or at least I have to say I didn't picture it at that time. And the vast majority were non-cancer conversations, or the majority of the non-cancer conversations were about people, work, leisure, food, health, all the things, right? And substantive non-cancer conversations predicted better well-being in the spirit of the idea that the quotidian part, those like beyond the 90%, those 10%, that the 90%, that those really, really matter. So ordinary topics characterize the daily conversations of couples coping with breast cancer. I realize I'm running a little late, so I'm going to skip over essentially a replication of that I did in collaboration with Eva Alisic at University of Melbourne, where we studied kids who have been in pediatric care for an accident, so kids with a potentially traumatic experience, where we also found that only a vast minority of conversations were about the injury, and where we also found that the non-injury conversations, how much and how the parents talk to the kids beyond the injury really colored how well the kid was doing. So to wrap it up, there really is, I want to kind of juxtapose, but it's not a juxtaposition in the sense of either or. It's really kind of on a spectrum, emphasizing one versus the other. I want to juxtapose a life event psychology and a quotidian psychology. From a life event perspective, in the life event perspective, the focus is on critical life events. This is what stands out. This is what you study. Whereas from the quotidian perspective, the focus lies on the everyday experience and behavior inside and outside of critical life events. They tend to use different methods. So typically, life event perspective links into existing longitudinal studies and picks up these discrete points across a person's life and then analyzes things around that. or invites people in the lab who are eligible, where the inclusion criteria specifies a critical life event, so lab experiments, whereas quotidian perspective usually adopts daily life research methods, experience sampling methods, ecological momentary assessment, intensive longitudinal data. From the target of life event perspective is typically the population and the sample of individuals. So you try to say that most people after divorce decrease but get back up. Most people after widowhood decrease in life, go back up. So you make inferences about a sample of individuals. I think the ideal reference point for the quotidian perspective is the individual and the samples of situations. So you really take a within person approach to, in moments when the person does X, the person feels better. And you try to generalize to a sample of situations. And I argue that those two perspectives also differ slightly in goal, that for the life event perspective, the goal is trajectories, creating trajectories of adjustment and prediction, whereas for the quotidian perspective, it is process and explanation. And with that, I want to conclude. Both the critical life event perspective and the quotidian perspective are important. They serve different purposes. The quotidian perspective on psychological phenomena is becoming easier and easier to employ with progress in mobile technologies. Now we don't have to have our observers anymore. We don't have to have these big video cameras. We don't even have to have the ear anymore. We have our smartphones and we have our wearables that provide these data along the way. What I argue it does, it holds the scientific magnifying glass over the 90%, 98% of our lives that don't seem to stand out. It reminds us to resist this fast forward impulse that Craik defined, that we tend to want to move on to what's really going on in your life, what's really exciting in your life. And it forces us to think how these ordinary mundane experiences and behavior, the little things in life, matter for our lives. With that, I want to thank you for your attention, thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me, thank the participants who wore the ear and really granted us access in their lives, to their lives, and thank all the research assistants who coded it, the students who led the project, and all the collaborators. Thank you very much.
We have a few questions from the audience, so we can jump into those. The first one is, how do you think these ideas of small talk versus deep conversation would translate to how we communicate online in conferencing spaces, as we all have via Zoom for the last year?
That's a very good question, and a very timely question. I think there's two stances. Some people, and they're probably both right in some way. Some people say that social media and the way they work and the way they incentivize, that they gear things towards the more superficial conversations and the likes and the followers and all of that. But there's nothing really in social media that prevents more substantive exchanges. And I know of a few studies, one by a Facebook researcher, that showed that when people don't just like a response, but when you measure when people actually provide a written response, and you could now go even further because Facebook suggests you all these template responses, right? When you defy that and you actually write an idiosyncratic response to a person, that would be the equivalent of a substantive conversation, because then the person feels really heard and feels really seen and guaranteed notices it. And so I think the mechanisms are the same in the online world and in the physical world, outside offline world. I think the affordances and what pulls you in one way, I think social media probably pulls you more strongly, even more strongly, into the superficial way. So it's harder to defy that gravitational pull.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So the next question is, do you think the happiness levels versus interaction would differ between introverts and extroverts?
That's a beautiful question, and that's also great. It makes perfect sense, and you would think so, right? Introverts argue that they don't really need all. The extroverts can live on small talk essentially, but the introverts, they really need the good conversation. We tested that. So in our study, in this replication study, we had extroversion as a moderator, and we had a sample size of almost 500. So you would hope that any non-trivial effect would show up. And I consider myself a personality psychologist, so I would have been very happy for it to show up. But it didn't. So I found that also somewhat surprising. But on the other hand, maybe it's not so surprising, because I think in terms of conversations, I think introverts and extroverts run on the same conversational fuel, that their happiness is fueled by the same fuel. We know that introverts tend to be extroverts tend to be slightly happier than introverts, possibly because they have more conversations. And in terms of the quantity, we found no difference. So my best guess is that the setting in which those happen might be different. So we did not check whether those substantive conversations happen more in a private context, in a private setting, more one-on-one, in more quiet contexts, maybe more over the phone, whereas for extroverts it happens more in larger groups. We did not test for that. But it's a good hypothesis. We had that too. It did not pin out. I think there's a study by Jesse Sun and Samin Wazir that does it within person, and I do believe they found some evidence of a moderation, I think, for the within person effect, that extroversion moderated the within person. So I think the jury is somewhat still out.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is similar to the first question. How do you think happiness from conversation, like the level of happiness that we gain from conversation, has changed because of everything going online during the pandemic?
No, I think the opportunities to interact are substantially less. Yeah, people came up with Zoom parties and all of this, but I think it requires a lot more effort to create an interaction than, Gillian Sundstrom, I think, she does wonderful research on those little interactions that we spontaneously have as we run into people, as we see people. I think the bar for having an interaction is much higher in the pandemic. Could we organize a Zoom party? Yeah, we can organize it every day, but do we organize it every day? And so it's much more regulated, much more deliberate. So I think, I don't have data, and we don't have an ear study on that people have a lot fewer interactions. And then again, while I think that the medium allows for, or the processes that can potentially unfold on social media or on Zoom are similar, the media to in person, so you can have good conversations. All of us have had experiences where we connect really well with somebody on Zoom, and we're like, wow, that was a great interaction. I'm so glad I reconnected with this person, and in the pandemic. But we also have cases where it felt shallow. So I think it's the medium makes it more difficult to have that, for the reduced number of channels that we have, for, some would argue, for the some kind of awkward context. So in some way, if you see my camera, you're actually in my private space. If this was in person, you would be too close to me. So there's all these differences in cues that make it odd, and we cannot ignore that. So I think it's just the affordances are different. The affordances make it harder. The opportunity structure has been worse, much worse.
All right. The last question is, were there differences in conversation between the person with cancer versus the partner? I'd imagine their methods of coping and therefore extent of conversation would be different.
Yes, and we were actually very interested in that. We haven't fully analyzed some of that. We mostly also hypothesized that for the partner, for example, it would be important to have a source of conversations outside the relationship, because there are certain concerns that the partner cannot voice being supportive that's difficult to voice for the partner with the patient, right? But that the partner has a way to cope with those outside. We haven't really been able to address this fully in terms of the topics of conversations, but we found an interesting difference. So, for example, in my lab, we do language research as well, and we look at we talk, like that we can in a relationship. People say, let's do this. We can do this together, and we should do this. We should go. When do we have our next appointment, next chemotherapy appointment? And in general, I think that the current sense is that we talk in the relationship suggests some sort of independence and is positively related to relationship quality. What we found here is that we talk was positively related to adjustment and well-being. So partner we talk. Partner we talk was positively related to adjustment and well-being for the patient. But the patient I talk was positively related. So the patient, because in the end, it is not the same. In the end, the patient is the one who has the cancer and who needs to go through all the treatment. There, it's important to actually take a certain, what's the right word? To accept the attention on the self for a certain amount. And so we found that ITOF was positively related to adjustment. That was one difference in the conversations that we empirically found. But I think there's many more beyond that. We just haven't tested them.